Good day. Today, 11th January, we continue to be in an operational lull, at least so far as I can judge, in terms of what is going on the battle lines in Ukraine. There are some indications that this could end next week. The British Defence Ministry spoke about a renewed Russian offensive in the Kharkiv region starting perhaps on Monday. Well, we shall have to wait and see. But for the moment, at least, I get the clear impression that Russian soldiers have been granted what is, if not exactly a Christmas break, at least they've been given some time to rest and reorganize ahead of the battles which are to come. There was a report that I saw that came from Ukrainian sources, which spoke about the manning levels of Russian units on the battle lines. And it said that they are typically between 95 and 98% up to strength. In other words, they are, to all intents and purposes, fully up to strength. And the Ukrainian reports that provided this information said that what this in effect meant was that the Russians are able to rotate forces, that they're able to take people away from the battle lines and take them to the rear to rest, and that this is something that the Russians routinely are able to do, whereas Ukraine, suffering far heavier losses, 30,000 dead or severely wounded every month, according to that report from ABC, which, by the way, amounts to 1,000 dead or severely wounded every day. Just saying. Well, the Ukrainians with much more depleted units, some of them very short of men now, they're not able to do that to anything like the same degree, so that whereas Russian soldiers can be brought back to the rear and can rest, Ukrainian soldiers have to keep fighting day after day, week after week, becoming more and more exhausted. Anyway, the timing of that piece of information from Ukraine did make me wonder whether the Ukrainians haven't detected some kind of rotation going on across the Russian front lines, whether perhaps what is actually happening is that after the Christmas period, as a result of the Christmas period, the Russians are taking advantage of it in order to pull back some of their frontline fighters, taking them back to the rear to rest and recuperate, and aren't in the process of replacing them with new fighters, new soldiers from the rear, able to take the attack forward further. And incidentally, the Ukrainians have also reported that there's now around 460,000 Russian troops present within the territory of 1991 Ukraine, just under 500,000 men. In other words, a very substantial Russian army indeed, probably an army which in aggregate now outnumbers the Ukrainian forces that are actually on the battlefronts, something which incidentally has not always been true during the war. Certainly in the summer and autumn of 2022, it was absolutely obvious to anybody who was following the fighting closely at that time that during the summer and autumn of 2022, it was the Ukrainians who very substantially outnumbered the Russians. Anyway, that's the situation at the moment. A relative lull, perhaps the Russians engaging in a troop rotation. Russian missile strikes, however, continue. The Russians have been busy bombarding Kharkiv. Ukraine's second biggest city, very heavily. There have been strikes on hotel buildings there. The Russians claim that they're hunting foreign mercenaries who they say are housed in these hotels. Again, I have no way of being able to corroborate whether that is actually the case or not. Ukrainians, by the way, deny that this is so. But anyway, that is what the Russians are doing. They're launching more missile and drone strikes on Kharkiv, and we continue to see more pictures, more photographic evidence showing the immense devastation that the three big Russian missile strikes, the one on the 29th of December, the 3rd of January, and the 8th of January, have cumulatively done on the industrial infrastructure of Ukraine. The damage has been massive, and I understand that the official figure for the number of people killed in the missile strike on the 8th of January, on the 3rd of January, on Kiev, now numbers 34, though that is only an official figure, and that's civilians principally who the Ukrainians are counting. We're getting lots of other reports of command bunkers and such things having been struck, and there is still reports circulating that in one of the factories that was also struck, as many as 50 production workers were killed. And there's been, by the way, an obituary notice that seems to confirm at least some casualties in that regard. It seems that a man and woman who were part of the same family appear to have been killed in one of these strikes. Another one of these terrible tragedies of the war. But anyway, missile strikes continue, rocket attacks continue. The Russians continue to press the Ukrainians all across the battlefronts. And the war continues, but for the moment at least, there has been a certain lull. Now, the Ukrainians themselves have been launching massive, or at least attempting to launch massive strikes on Crimea, on places further east within the 1991 borders of Russia. So a number of people have pointed out these missile and drone strikes seem to have been almost completely unsuccessful. I discussed this previously. I said that it was very interesting that there was one brief moment when the Ukrainians were able to penetrate the Russian air defenses and were able to hit that shipyard in that naval location in Feodosia in Crimea, and were able to destroy an amphibious warfare ship that was docked there. But that particular event is looking increasingly atypical. It seems that before that particular strike, the Russians had the situation pretty much under control in terms of Ukrainian missile and drone attacks on Crimea and other places of the Black Sea. And since that particular incident, the Russians have had it under control again. And that does beg the question about how that incident took place. I've discussed it in a previous program. I speculated that the Russians had to stand down some of their surveillance aircraft in the area because of the presence of Ukrainian air defense missiles on the west bank of the Dnieper. Now that those air defense missiles have been eliminated, presumably those surveillance aircraft are operating again, and that it makes it easier for the Russians to track and destroy Ukrainian missiles, Scalp missiles and Storm Shadow missiles, as the Ukrainians attempt to launch them at targets in Crimea and on the Black Sea. And it isn't just missiles. There's been an admission from Ukraine that their drones, their sea drones, aren't proving as effective as they were. And we've had a comment about this from the Ukrainian Navy commander, Alexei Nezhpapa. He has said that as we use technology, the enemy develops countermeasures. He said this in an interview with Ukrainska Pravda. Some of our tricks, utilization tactics, which worked in 2022 and 2023 will not pass in 2024. So you need to change tactics, change the technical specifications of everything you do. And he is apparently specifically discussing sea drones. And it looks as if the Russians have also managed to get on top of the problem of Ukrainian sea drones. But as Commander Nezhpapa's words say, the Ukrainians are still trying to find ways around that. He said that there's going to be a period of very heavy drone wars, and that seems entirely plausible. I discussed in a recent program how the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, seems to be saying much the same thing. We'll come to all this in a moment. But for the moment, at least, the Russians seem to have got on top of the problem of sea drones. Incidentally, there has been a number of pictures now, satellite photos and all that, taken showing the locations of Russian warship deployments in the Black Sea area. And while it does indeed seem to be the case that the larger part of the Russian Black Sea Fleet has dispersed its warships in bases like Novorossiysk and other places east of Crimea, it is clear that despite claims to the contrary, there are still quite a large number of Russian warships of various descriptions located in Russia's Crimean naval bases. So it is not correct that the Russians have pulled all their fleet in its entirety out of Crimea. And the fact that there are still warships there strongly suggests that the Russians do believe that they have the missile threat, at least, under control. Anyway, as I said, there are many pictures of damage from the Russian missile and airstrikes. And it's important to say that notwithstanding that, as I said, there is a Christmas lull, that doesn't mean that fighting has stopped. It does still go on. There have been claims that the Ukrainians have regained some ground in the Liman area. I have to say, this is all based upon FPV drone strikes, so far as I can tell. And I'm not sure how much weight, I sometimes wonder whether too much weight is being placed on geolocations of FPV drone strikes. But anyway, that's another story, and I'm not a close reporter of these things, and I'm not going to spend too much meditating about that issue. All I would say is I think some people perhaps are underestimating the sheer fluidity of the fighting and the way in which troops move backwards and forwards in various locations as these very complex encounter battles do take place. But regardless, it seems indisputable that the Russians are continuing further advances in the Avdiivka area, in the Bakhmut area as well, and perhaps interestingly, though perhaps not so importantly, in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, where, as I said in my last program, a Russian reporter, a Russian journalist, has come back and has claimed that the two Ukrainian brigades that are defending this salient, Bradley Square, as it has increasingly come to be called, that they're in effect in a kind of cauldron, though I have expressed my own doubts about this. There may have been a lull, but with constant Russian missile and drone attacks across Ukraine, Ukraine continues to receive very heavy damage. And in fact, what we can say with some not confidence is that over the course of the last few weeks, there does seem to have been a general increase in casualties on both sides, but perhaps, and I accept that this is going to be a bit controversial, especially maybe on the Ukrainian side. As I said, ABC tells us that Ukrainian doctors are now saying that they estimate Ukrainian losses in terms of dead and heavily wounded to be around 1,000 a day. And in the meantime, the mobilization law remains stuck in the Ukrainian parliament. It remains deeply controversial, and there's clearly a reluctance, an unwillingness on the part of the politicians to sign off on it. This is despite the fact that there are now growing rumblings of discontent by Ukrainian frontline soldiers, that they're exhausted, that they've been fighting for far too long, that many of their comrades are dead or wounded, that they've been parted for far too long from their families, and they urgently need relief so that they can go back to the rear to meet with their families again and enjoy some kind of rotation. Anyway, despite all of those rumblings, despite the very heavy losses the Ukrainians have suffered, despite Ukrainian admissions that Russian military units are up to strength and theirs are not, the Ukrainian parliament continues to delay its passing approval of the draft mobilization law. This has been a very prolonged saga now. I can remember first discussion of the need for further mobilization in Ukraine starting in mid-autumn. We've now been several weeks down this process, and we've still not reached a resolution. And in the meantime, the president himself of Ukraine, President Zelensky, has once again taken the opportunity to leave the country. He's gone on a trip to the Baltic states. Again, there's uncertainty, as there always is, about his exact itinerary. One gets the sense sometimes that President Zelensky makes decisions about which countries he's going to visit very much at the last moment. And it may be that having visited the 3 Baltic states, he's going to make a decision to visit somewhere else in the West as well. But anyway, he's been in the Baltic states. He's made all the usual comments and speeches. He says that Ukraine is fighting on behalf of Europe. He is admitting, or coming very close to admitting, that Ukraine's situation is becoming extremely perilous, that it needs Western aid to keep fighting. He refuses, however, to consider any thought of negotiation. He talks about dreaming of a future without Russia. This is to the Baltic states. It's quite an astonishing statement, in fact, and one which, if it had been made about certain other countries, might have provoked from parts of the Western media some accusations. I'm not going to go into the detail of that at the moment. But anyway, he goes there, and of course he's now busy promoting this idea that if Ukraine falls, the Russians won't stop. They'll march on Moldova, that goes without saying, but they'll march on the Baltic states as well. He is saying things to the leaders of the people of the Baltic states which appear to be calculated to intensify the growing nervousness that the leaders and the people, or some of the people of these countries, must already feel. And I'm afraid he's not the only person who's conjuring up these images of a Russian march west. I already spoke about how Colonel Hamish de Breton Gordon in Britain is now claiming that if Russia wins in Ukraine, Europe will be next. There will be a war between Europe and Russia within 3 years. He puts it as melodramatically as that. In his latest piece, Hamish is talking about a huge Russian offensive in Kharkiv region, and he says that this is going to happen before the presidential election in March, and he says that in order to break through, the Russians are going to have to use apocalyptic methods, including up to and including the use of tactical nuclear weapons. It's remarkable how that particular claim has been dusted off again. Anyway, putting all that aside, all of these absurd exaggerations aside, this story, this legend of the Russian march west is gaining increasing traction. I've even seen a film of a city which, from what I could tell, was Berlin. It's obviously a simulation, coming under missile attack in the same way that Kiev comes under missile attacks. You see flashes and plumes of smoke and broken windows and smashed in facades of buildings. And the implication is that what's happening to Kiev will soon be happening to Berlin also. There's increasing talk of this kind from some European politicians who really should know better. And I'm going to say I think that this is both irresponsible and ultimately foolish, because it doesn't seem as if there's any prospect that, well, I can't personally see that there is any prospect of Western intervention changing the trajectory of events in Ukraine. As I've said before, this huge Western investment that we saw in Ukraine in 2022 and 2023 has not paid off. Russia has not been defeated. Its army is much stronger now than it was in 2022, and it's much bigger, and its equipment base is increasing in size. So it's difficult to see, given the exhaustion of the West's defense industries, their inability to keep up with Ukrainian demands and the competing demands around the world. It's difficult to see how an effort comparable to the one the West did to support Ukraine in 2022 and 2023 can be continued, given that the Russians are getting stronger, that the Ukrainians are getting weaker, that the West can't change things. All of these claims, reports that, if the Russians win in Ukraine, they will come fighting here. If, we must fight them over there, because if we don't, they will fight us over here. Well, all of that, it seems to me, eventually, it's going to create problems, because to the extent that people in the West, principally in Germany and in the Baltic states, come to believe it, how will they react when Ukraine falls? Will they panic? Will they demand further action from their governments? In the Baltic states, will people leave? There's already heavy emigration from the Baltic states. what will they do? And of course, if that doesn't happen and people remain calm, when it becomes clear that the Russians are not interested in marching again on Berlin or Paris or anywhere else further west, what does it do to the credibility of those who claimed that they would? Well, I suspect that there will be an attempt to pretend that these dark predictions were never made. But there we are. So anyway, there's a lot of this narrative now gaining traction. And it is indeed the case that overall, in aggregate terms, Western defenses are getting weaker because so many weapons have been sent to Ukraine that West European armies in particular are now very short of equipment. The US military, to some extent, apparently is also, particularly shells. And we hear every day about more and more weapon systems appearing on Russian battle lines. Now, since I've come to that particular topic, I should say that I have received a very interesting set of emails from an extremely authoritative source. Again, I'm not going to say who it is, but suffice to say that I know this source to be completely authoritative, absolutely ridiculing, I mean, taking to pieces, shredding that whole business that I saw in Hamish's article of the other day about tractor factories now having been converted in Russia to tank production. And this source was able to provide me with some of the historical background to this story. It's provided me with photos of some of the tractors that the Soviet Union was building in the 1930s, which actually do look enormous, like tanks, in other words, with caterpillars and all of that, caterpillar tracks and all of that. They look like tanks. And of course, industrially, in terms of the technologies of that time, those kind of tractors were not that different from tanks. And it made sense, therefore, for, in a condition of total war, for tractors, for the factories that made those tractors, to convert to producing tanks. But of course, we're living in a completely different technological and industrial world today. I doubt that tractors that look like the ones I see in these photographs from the 1930s are produced in Russia or indeed anywhere anymore. The tractors that are produced today are completely different and very unlike tanks. And of course, the tanks of today are entirely different from the kind of tanks that were built in the 1930s. But all of this is really beside the point. The fact is, the Russians have not converted tractor factories to tank production. In fact, tractor production of agricultural equipment in Russia is increasing. There is no sign of any diversion of production, agricultural production, machinery production, to military purposes taking place. And just as all those reports about the Russians advancing on Berlin all over again have no basis in any fact, so these claims about Russia transferring to a total war economy have no basis in fact either. I want to reiterate a point I had made before because I think it is an important one, as I am seeing this whole narrative about the Russian war economy taking hold. that Russia's economy today is not a war economy. I don't know the exact percentage of GDP that Russia is committing to defense purposes. I've heard that it might be as high as 6%, which seems to me a plausible figure, up from 3%, though I suspect that even that is a guess. GDP, as it turns out, is now higher than it was before the war began, so maybe, despite the increase in military production, the share of defense spending and the defense part of the economy in GDP may not have risen by as much as some people suppose. But one way or the other, it is a complete misunderstanding that this is a war economy or anything like it. Now, I say this because President Putin, who is currently on what I take to be a pre-election or campaign tour in Russia's far eastern regions, in Chukotka and places like that, he has been talking quite a lot about the economy. And he's presenting, as well one would expect, of a politician seeking re-election, a generally positive view about the economy. He has said that it's possible, it's not yet as confirmed, that GDP growth in 2023 might be as big as 4%. There might have been growth up to the level of 4% in 2023. That might be a bit optimistic. He's admitted that the previous prediction was 3.5%. We will have to see. He also says that Russia is now indisputably the biggest economy in Europe. He says, it seems that we are being strangled and pressured from every side, but still we are the largest economy in Europe. We left Germany behind and climbed to 5th in the world in terms of GDP and purchasing power parity. China, the US, India, Japan, and Russia. We are number one in Europe. He then did throw in a caveat. He said, we have left all of Europe behind in terms of purchasing power parity, but as for the per capita indicator, we need to work harder. There is still work to be done. Saying that, he did have a discussion with a Russian business leader, Alexei Repik. Alexei Repik said, shouldn't take Japan too seriously. We're going to overtake Japan fairly soon. And if you actually look at GDP statistics in terms of, or calculations in terms of purchasing power parity, actually, Russia isn't that far behind Japan now. I believe that Japan's economy is at $5.7 trillion GDP on a purchasing power parity basis. Russia's is $5.4 trillion, again, on a purchasing power parity basis. Anyway, Putin came along and said, we can't discount Japan. He says, like many European countries, economies, Japan is a high-tech economy. I'm going to say, actually, that I think here, I'm not going to say I entirely agree with Repik. Undoubtedly, Japan's economy retains enormous strengths, and especially in manufacturing and technology, exactly as Putin said, and it has some of the world's leading industrial companies, Sony, Mitsubishi, Toyota, all of those. But it's probably fair to say that Japan's economy has not been growing that dynamically now for quite a few years, at least since the early 1990s when the Japanese financial crisis hit home. And it's also probably fair to say that the Russian economy has a very, very much bigger resource base. It has far more raw materials. Japan has always been short of raw materials. It has a far bigger agricultural sector. Logically, it ought to be a bigger economy than Japan's. And I know quite a few people who think that actually it probably already is. Having said that, I want to stress again that when Putin says that one shouldn't just write off Japan, he's absolutely right. Maybe in a few years' time, maybe in not so many years' time, the Russians will indeed, in terms of purchasing power parity, have been acknowledged by the various statistical services around the World Banks, the IMFs, their own, as having surpassed Japan's economy and become number 4. But anyway, Japan will surely remain, for the foreseeable future, a significant economic force. But anyway, Putin is talking about all of that. He was talking about how Russia's economy is strong and resilient and becoming stronger, how living standards are improving, even though, as he was careful to say, in terms of per capita, Russia is still well below the major West European countries, and in his words, still has work to do. But he also had reasonably optimistic things to say on the inflation front, which has been obviously a concerning issue. Inflation, probably around 7.5% in 2023. Interest rates much higher, at about 16%. The central bank's base rate now at about 16%. Nabulina, the head of the central bank, has signaled that the central bank's rate increases have probably now reached their end point. We'll see. But anyway, Putin said central bank interest rate will come down soon. Its increase was only a temporary measure. Inflation is due to fall. There's been an awful lot of talk recently in Russia about the surge in egg prices. This became a hot topic in Russia, even picked up as such in the West, perhaps given an exaggerated amount of attention in the West. But he's confident that inflation will fall over the course of 2024. And I believe, by the way, that he is overall, that he is right. But the key point to understand, and the central point I want to make again, is that this is not a war economy, not by any stretch of the imagination. You see none of the signs that you would expect to see in a typical war economy. There's no signs of rationing or anything of that kind. Nothing like that is taking place in Russia, and the budget is coming out strong. And we've had some words about this from the finance ministry. They say, according to preliminary estimates, federal budget revenues in 2023 amounted to 29.123 trillion rubles, which is 4.7% higher than the volume of revenues received in 2022. That's the most astonishing point, because bear in mind that in 2022, oil and gas prices were extremely high. Russia received a big bonus from the fact that oil and gas revenues were so high that year. The current account rose to extraordinary levels, and of course the budget came up very strongly as a result. Many people I know were predicting, especially with the oil price cap, which came into effect at the start of last year, that the Russian budget would be under much greater stress this year, rather in 2023. Well, it hasn't turned out that way. Growth in the domestic economy has more than made up, apparently, for declines in receipts from the oil and gas sector. And the result is the total receipts are 4.7% higher. And the result is that the budget deficit has shrunk. It was just $9.8 billion in the first 11 months of 2023. We don't yet have a complete figure for the GDP percentage that is the budget deficit, but it's probably going to be around 1.5% below the finance ministry's expected target of 2%. So that, let me stress again, is not really consistent with what you would expect to see in the event that there was a war economy operating. If Russia was a war economy, if Russia had been running a war economy last year, the budget deficit would certainly have soared, and the government would be taking all the usual steps that war economies do in order to try to cover that deficit. There would undoubtedly have been some money printing. There would also have been forced loans of the kind that were very, very common during the war of the 1940s, the Second World War. All of the major combatants engaged in forced loans, essentially exactions from the population, which was supposed to be repaid later. Anyway, there would have been emergency tax hikes. Russia has engaged in a certain amount of that, but nothing on anything like the scale that you would expect to see in a war economy type of scenario. And as I said, no signs of rationing, no signs of undue stress anywhere in the economic system. And this mythology about a war economy is leading people to misunderstand the nature of what is happening, because I think the assumption that the Russians are in a war economy type situation, that they're having to devote virtually all their industrial output to weapons production, like, say, the Germans did in the late 30s and during the war, the Second World War. I think that gives people the idea, firstly, that this growth in Russia is unsustainable, that Russian defense spending is unsustainable, that it will have a big impact on Russia's future economic growth prospects, and that the West can either wait out Russia, because eventually it will exhaust itself as a result of all of this enormous burden that the economy is taking on through all this enormous defense expenditure, or, if you want to take the alarmist view, that the Western countries need to prepare themselves, because as Russia has converted to a war economy, that must mean that they're not only going to have to defeat Ukraine, but that they're going to have to advance and attack Western Europe, because you can't just unwind a war economy. You've got to keep it going. It's like the cyclist on the bicycle. You have to continue to head forward. Now, as I said, this simply isn't true. What we are actually going to see most probably is renewed economic strength in Russia and an economy that is indeed able to go on producing the various weapons that it is producing. Now, yesterday I said that I got what I believe to be a true report about Russian stockpiling of artillery shells. I said that in one area, the Russians had stockpiled around 1 million shells, just one area of the battlefronts. And they seem to be doing that right across the front lines, pointing to preparations, I am sure, for a big offensive. But we are hearing all the time about not just floods of weapons pouring to the military, but also new types of weapons. Now, the Russians have been working for many years on developing a new generation of self-propelled guns, the so-called Koalitsiya guns, with of 152 millimeter calibers. And these are said to be a technological leap upwards from the Star B self-propelled guns that the Russians have been operating. Anyway, this is a protracted program. It has now been prioritized. It seems that these Koalitsiya self-propelled guns have now completed their development cycle. They've now been placed in serial production. It's expected that they will be distributed. They will start to appear with the troops shortly. Other new weapon systems that are coming on stream is a new version of the Panzer point defense system. And here we're talking about not just one actual new development of the Panzer system, but several. There's one which is clearly significantly enhanced. It's got more powerful radars, more powerful tracking devices, missiles with longer range, all of that. And this is clearly intended to provide protection against Ukrainian missile strikes in places like Crimea and elsewhere. But there is also a tracked version of the Panzer system entering service, apparently, and it is clearly intended to accompany the armored columns as they move forward on the battlefronts. And the point about this version of the Panzer system, presumably with its more advanced radars, and one must assume that it will be operating with various other vehicles and surveillance devices, is that it looks to me to be part of a plan to counter the problems caused by Ukrainian FPV drones and other such things. And apparently the Russians are also developing all kinds of electronic warfare devices, jamming devices. The number of these jamming devices is increasing right across the military, again, as a counter to Ukrainian drones, FPV drones. Of course, the Russians have many more FPV drones than Ukraine does, but they're able to now develop counters to these drones to an extent that Ukraine by itself cannot, and the West also seems increasingly unable to do. And so those kind of things also appearing. There's more reports of new batches of Russian kamikaze drones. I've discussed this in several programs now. Jet-powered versions of the Duran 2, new suicide drones to be used on a tactical basis, Lancets, advanced Lancets, and other such things also beginning to appear on the battlefronts. And of course, tanks. And again, that same authoritative source that has comprehensively debunked Hamish's claims about tractor factories, as I said, all legends going back to the 1940s. Anyway, he's provided further information about tank production in Russia, where it takes place, what sort of tanks are being built or refurbished, the way they're likely to be used, that kind of thing. So, my overall sense is Russia continuing to conduct strategic attrition, continuing to do what Shoigu said in that speech that I discussed 2 days ago, continuing to deplete Ukrainian forces, weaken them, do increasing amounts of damage to them, damage Ukrainian infrastructure, damage Ukrainian warehouses and factories, but at the same time, building up its forces, stockpiling shells, building more tanks, building more drones, building more aircraft, introducing weapon systems intended to counter and negate the effect of some of the weapons that Ukraine itself is using, its drones and such like. We've seen how this has been generally effective in the Black Sea area. Ukrainian missiles no longer hitting their targets, Ukrainian admirals admitting that their sea drones are no longer working as they once were. All of this build up going on, and the Ukrainians still arguing and debating and talking about their mobilization law and unable to come to a final decision about it. Now, it seems to me that the trajectory of events could not be more clear. I've discussed many times the paralysis of decision making in Europe and in Washington. In fact, very alarmingly, even as the paralysis of decision making in Europe gets worse, there doesn't seem to be a coherent plan about what to do. There is what I can only describe as a rather disturbing authoritarian turn. In Germany, it's become increasingly clear that the German government is becoming increasingly unpopular. Chancellor Scholz has become a deeply unpopular leader in Germany. He has support from 27% of the German people, but the rest apparently are unimpressed with him. There's opinion polling that coming out from Germany, which shows that more and more Germans are becoming more and more skeptical, not just about the war, but about the entire agenda of Germany supposedly having to take a lead to assert itself against aggressors, not just Russia, but China too, and all of that. Most Germans feeling that this isn't really a burden that Germany should take on itself, but nonetheless, what the German political class insists that it must do. And we see the same trend right across Europe, as well as growing indications that the European economy is now getting into deeper economic difficulties. Recession seems to be becoming normalized. We're not talking about an economic collapse, but of a European economy that is not just stagnating, but which is slipping backwards with more and more factories closing. In Russia, I read a report just recently that 100 new big industrial facilities opened over the course of 2023. In Germany, of course, by contrast, factories, big industrial facilities are closing down. And as I said, the response seems to be an authoritarian turn. In Germany, there's now increasing debates about banning the AfD, Germany's second most popular party. The German intelligence, one of the German intelligence agencies has apparently said that the AfD branch in Saxony, in eastern Germany, is a threat to democracy. which many see as the first step towards banning this party, I have to say, if such an extraordinary step is taken, one which disenfranchises around a quarter of the German electorate, then, in my opinion, the Federal Republic of Germany, the Bundesrepublik, which has existed all my life and which has been the most stable political entity that Germany has had for most of its history, well, if a step like that is taken, the days of the Bundesrepublik are probably coming to an end. I cannot see myself how it could survive such a step. We see that in France, the president, Emmanuel Macron, has just sacked his government. He's provided no real explanation of why he has decided to sack the prime minister at this time. There's no evidence. He's given no reason to think that he thinks that she has been doing a bad job, for example. Many, no doubt, would say that she has, but he's given no such explanation. There is, in fact, however, a general sense of malaise gripping France as well, and it's fairly well, I think, understood amongst most people who follow these things that Monsieur Attal, the new French Prime Minister, 34, the youngest Prime Minister that I think France has ever had, in a country which, by the way, historically tended to be led by older men, just saying, the one period when it was different, as I remember, was the period of the French Revolution, when some people who came to power were even younger than Monsieur Attal is. But anyway, never mind. The only real reason that Monsieur Attal has been picked and has become Prime Minister is because he is self-evidently being groomed to become President Macron's successor and to take on Marine Le Pen in the forthcoming presidential election in 2027. So that's the major priority in France. There's a deep sense of malaise in France, but again, you look for a telegenic personality and hope that that will turn things round. And I predict that just as in Germany, the calls, which are already quite widespread in France, to press criminal proceedings against Marine Le Pen will grow, leading to the inevitable suspicions that that is being done again in order to prevent her standing for the presidency. And all of that, no doubt, combined with further action against the party. And all of this is now being overshadowed by even starker events that are happening in Poland. Now, I should say straight away, I am not, by any stretch of the imagination, a fan of the Law and Justice Party that has led Poland for many years and which in the recent parliamentary election was voted out of power. I think its foreign policy has been disastrous. I think it led Poland, which could have had a major stabilizing influence in Eastern Europe, along entirely the wrong path, into a close alliance with Ukraine, which was unpopular with many people in Poland, and into a conflict with Russia, which I emphatically do not believe is in Polish national interests. In fact, as I have spoken many times and on many occasions, I think that the correct policy for the Polish government, a Polish government to follow, would be to build a strong, stable relationship with Russia, one which might be patterned over the rapprochement achieved in the 1950s and 1960s by Adenauer and de Gaulle between Germany and France. And I believe that had that happened, we would have had a much more stable and balanced situation in Europe. But anyway, Law and Justice did their own thing. They may have done things badly wrong. Their policies might have been profoundly misconceived, but they're still the biggest political party in Poland. And what we now see is that ever since the new government led by Mr. Donald Tusk has come in, he has pursued a policy which, so far as I can tell, seems to have its objective the ultimate destruction of the Law and Justice Party. He has taken control of Polish television in the most arbitrary way. Maybe you think that Polish television was skewed and biased towards Law and Justice, and perhaps that's right. But basically, taking direct control of the television stations, closing them down in one fell swoop. Well, was that really necessary? After all, Mr. Tusk has recently won an election, despite television being supportive of Law and Justice. He could have taken his time. He could have done this in a more measured way. Such things are generally done like that. It's perhaps important to say that whatever your views about the way in which Law and Justice gained control of the media, they didn't do it in quite the way that Mr. Tusk has now done. And now, of course, he has sent in the police into the president's residence to arrest two political figures from the period of Law and Justice's time in office. And this was done whilst the president was away from his residence, meeting, of all people, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the head of the Belarusian opposition. When the president discovered what was happening, he tried to turn back, to return to his residence, no doubt to intervene with the police, to try to stop the arrest of these two people. And his way back was barred when a bus blocked the road to his motorcade, or at least that's the reports. I'm not going to get into, again, the legal details of all of this. But again, was this really necessary? Whatever these two people are alleged to have done, and I understand their corruption and abuse of power allegations, Mr. Duda apparently pardoned them. There doesn't seem to be any doubt that he does actually have the power to pardon people. So why reopen this whole issue? Why do it in this incredibly public way? It's clearly also, it seems to me, an attempt to humiliate the president, Mr. Duda, and to create an atmosphere of crisis in Poland, perhaps provoke protests which will lead to further crackdowns. So, in place of policy, in place of a realistic reassessment of a whole line of policy that has been taken, which has brought Europe to deep crisis, where the economy is in bad shape, what we see again is the resort to these extraordinary methods, to the possible banning of the AfD in Germany, to further games of political theatre in France, and perhaps authoritarian responses to come, and in Poland, actions which, had they been taken against their political opponents by Law and Justice when they were in power, would have invited a storm of protest across Europe from all the usual people who are no doubt secretly pleased that all of these things have been done, a storm of protest which would have been wholly justified. And that is apparently all. That's the only real response that European leaders seem to have. The Italian defense minister has come up with some mumbling words that further military and economic aid to Ukraine from Italy should be linked to Ukrainian agreement to engage in Russia in negotiations. But it's clear that the defense minister is not talking with the authority and support of the Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, who remains as committed to Project Ukraine as always. And even the defense minister made this with all kinds of qualifications and caveats. He said that if the Russians, in order for Ukraine to negotiate with the Russians must make the first move. They must cease their missile and drone strikes on Ukraine in order to enable negotiations to move forward, which of course the Russians will never do, because the Russians will know that if they do cease their missile and drone strikes on Ukraine, then all that will happen, assuming that negotiations begin, which is actually extremely unlikely, is that Ukraine and the Western powers will simply string out the negotiations as long as they can, ensuring that they never achieve any kind of outcome for no other purpose than to prevent the Russian missile and drone strikes and to give Ukraine time to try to rebuild as best it can its air defense system. So, mumbled proposals that are completely unconvincing and that are going to carry no weight in Moscow at all, combined with, across Europe, a deeply troubling authoritarian turn from precisely the people who supposedly are saying that they are there to defend democracy. Of course, in the United States, arguably, things are a little better, but at least there is a pushback there. There does seem to be genuine debate about President Biden and about whether he really is an appropriate person to remain president. I discussed briefly yesterday the fact that the cover of The Economist now makes it fairly clear that that massively establishment organ, media organ, wants him to step down. But at least there's some kind of a debate in the United States. In Europe, to all intents and purposes, there is none at all. And I noticed that Boris Johnson has now come forward and has apparently denied that he played a role in wrecking the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul, despite the fact that the record overwhelmingly points otherwise. There's a good article by Ben Harris, the economics commentator, the Russian economics, the economics commentator about Russia. He's British. Anyway, Ben Harris, there's been a good article about this very point by him. Anyway, let me quickly now turn to a further subject, one which we're going to be discussing in more detail on the Duran, I'm sure, and about which we're going to do lots of programs and about which I'm confident I will be returning to in this on this channel. But the ICJ has now opened hearings on the claim that South Africa has brought against Israel connected to the events in Gaza. The United States government and Israel itself are clearly unhappy and nervous about this claim. More and more Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia, are backing this claim. And I myself am surprised that the ICJ has begun hearings on this claim so soon after it was brought. Now, I want to make it very clear that from what I understand, and as of the time of making this program, I have not been able to follow the live stream that Al Jazeera is providing about the application that is being made to the ICJ. From my understanding, this is a preliminary hearing. Its purpose, presumably, is twofold: to decide whether this plaint can be brought at all, and secondly, to decide whether any prejudgment relief, like some kind of injunction against Israel, requiring Israel to perhaps desist from some of its operations in Gaza, should be brought pending the final decision. And that final decision is sure to be years away. I mean, there will be years of litigation, of legal argument, of argument and counter-argument before the ICJ makes a final judgment. And that will only, of course, happen if it makes a decision to hear this case at all, which, as of the time of making this program, I don't know that it will. What I will say is this: I am surprised that the ICJ has decided to hear this case so fast. Presumably, it has done so because of the nature of the plaint, the allegations against Israel that are being made in it. If the ICJ were to decide that there was an arguable case there, I think that it would probably feel obliged to make an order of some kind requiring Israel to restrain its actions. And that's probably something that has driven the ICJ to make this, to hold this hearing now. I have to say, the fact that the ICJ has decided to hold a hearing so fast suggests to me that at least some of the judges may think, as I, by the way, unequivocally do, that this case does actually have merit and should be heard. The United States says the case is meritless. I take a completely contrary view. But I'm going to say this: even if there is just a preliminary ruling over the next couple of days, granting permission for South Africa to proceed with this case and granting, no doubt, South Africa's application for some kind of restraining order on Israel, then even if Israel disregards that ruling, which it is bound to do, and even if the United States backs Israel in that decision, which it will probably do, this will be a shockingly embarrassing thing for the West. It will be very difficult to defend that internationally. The West endlessly talks about the rules-based international order. It's been spending its time lobbying countries around the world to sign up to the Rome Statute and to enforce the indictment against that the ICC, a different court, by the way, has brought against President Putin of Russia. How does it simply turn around and say that a decision of the ICJ is wrong and should be disregarded, especially given that the ICJ has a much longer and more storied history than the ICC? And again, if the ICJ makes a decision, even if it's only a preliminary decision, to a decision restricted to hearing the case and perhaps also a decision to make some kind of restraining order against Israel. Inevitably, that is going to pile on the pressure on the ICC. And the ICC clearly avoided making any kind of decision up to now. They show no desire to take action against Israel or Israeli officials at all, despite some of the things, terrible things, that these Israeli officials have said. But if the ICJ says that there's an arguable case and imposes a restraining order, how does the ICC justify continuing to sit on its hands? It seems to me that at that point, the pressure is going to become overwhelming upon the ICC for it to take some kind of action also. Now, all that happens, to my mind, that will be a dreadfully embarrassing, indeed all but catastrophic outcome for Israel to some extent, but for its Western backers, for the United States, and even more for Israel's European backers, first and foremost Germany. And I don't know, I can't even begin to guess how they will respond to it. In fact, it would be such an enormous blow that I do wonder what they're going to do over the next couple of hours and days to prevent the ICJ from making the kind of decision that I'm just talking about. But anyway, the stakes in this are now becoming extremely high. And yet again, we can see how this policy that the West took back in October, that the Biden administration took back in October to give the Israeli government and Prime Minister Netanyahu, in effect, a blank check, is having very bad consequences for the West, perhaps even catastrophic ones, if the ICJ makes the decision that I think there is a chance it might do. Well, we will see. Suffice to say that the situation in the Middle East remains very difficult. We've got still huge concentrations of US troops and ships in the Middle East. We have all kinds of threats from the US and other Western powers against specifically the Houthis. Israel's been threatening Hezbollah. There's been talk about strikes on Iran. So far, thankfully, none of these things have happened. But the Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, remains in hospital. The fact that he kept his illness concealed from the President and the White House has apparently created much confusion and anger in the United States, as it should do. It's been widely commented upon around the world. It has increased the appearance that of division and confusion within the administration. Alex Christofor and I did a program about this some days ago on the Duran, and there's now been an article to that very effect in Global Times, the Chinese newspaper. So, United States, again, unable to control events in the Middle East, unable to come to coherent policies, unable to make, it seems, decisions, and seeing things happen like these proceedings in the ICJ, which should have been anticipated. I have warned many times in the past about possible litigation against Israel and against Israeli officials, but which no one seems to have thought about or taken steps to preempt or avoid. This inability of Western leaders to make decisions is creating an accumulation of problems which are becoming more intractable with every single passing day, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East, and there is no sign of that ending. Instead, we have, at least in Europe, to some extent also in the United States, an authoritarian turn, which is only going to make matters worse still. Well, that ends my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop and get yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you like this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.